LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, Nate Silver on poker, politics, and the art of risking everything. Do you follow American politics? If you do, you've been on an emotional roller coaster for the last decade. The stakes have never seemed higher. Sometimes it feels like the future of the world, at least the world we recognize, hangs in the balance. In the midst of all this chaos, Nate Silver, the founder of FiveThirtyEight, emerged as a voice of reason, calmly predicting likely election outcomes and explaining the math. He's a Spock-like figure, soothing our histrionics with his statistical models. In 2008, he correctly called 49 out of 50 states. In 2012...
So Nate, obviously a great night for the president, but also a great night for you and your forecast model, which is performing pretty much perfectly right now, I think, depending on...
But then, in 2016...
Nate, you nailed 2008, you nailed 2012. Where do you have the race today?
So we have Hillary Clinton getting about 300 electoral votes, have her leading by about 3 points nationally, and she's about a 2-to-1 favorite to win tomorrow in our model's view.
We all know how that turned out. When the election was called for Trump, I remember feeling sucker punched, in a state of shock and disorientation. What just happened? How could we get it so wrong? How could Nate get it so wrong? The next day, The Wrap ran an article with the headline, "Nate Silver blew it bigly on the election. Can his brand recover?" It was a frustrating moment, not just for Democrats, but also for Nate. His model, as it turned out, got it less wrong than everyone else. On election day, he gave Clinton a 71% chance of winning. Compare that to the Princeton Election Consortium, which put her odds at 99%. Furthermore, Nate didn't set out to be an election soothsayer, let alone our collective therapist. He got his start playing poker, and to this day he's more comfortable in a casino than at a political convention. Which is probably why last year he left FiveThirtyEight, now part of Disney, and this week is publishing a book about going back to his roots. It's called On the Edge, The Art of Risking Everything, and it's about a community that Nate calls the River.
They're basically people that have two sets of personality traits, one of which is strong analytical abilities. So these are mostly quantitative risk takers, people in tech, poker, finance, crypto, but they pair that with being extremely competitive, wanting to prove other people wrong, being a bit contrarian sometimes, but wanting to compete and be willing to take risks in order to do that.
This is Nate's tribe.
The other day I played a poker game where I'm betting 5 figures per hand, right? I have a high risk tolerance and probably some thrill-seeking tendencies. I like roller coasters. I like spicy food.
He's certainly more comfortable floating in the river than he is standing on the shore with the villagers. His term for the left-leaning academics, journalists, and politicians who, from the perspective of those on the river, prize emotion over facts and get off on moral superiority.
The village I've never quite gotten along with, and part of the self-discovery in the book is trying to understand why.
That's not to say that he's blindly loyal to the river. He worries that their appetite for extreme risk-taking may put us all in peril when it comes to potentially world-ending technology like artificial intelligence. But he's convinced that in the battle between the river and the village is winning, accruing more wealth and more power. Like it or not, people in the river are increasingly running our world, so we'd be smart to try and understand how they think. Though it may not have been his original intention, On the Edge, scheduled to be released tomorrow, delivers the political therapy that I have come to expect from Nate, this time with a more comprehensive explanation of how our world is changing. He articulates more clearly than anyone recently why the parents are squabbling and how we can all better understand one another and more accurately forecast what the future holds.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
Nate Silver, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you so much, Rufus.
Nate, your new book, On the Edge, was not what I was expecting. It's really, in my opinion, like several books in one. It's part memoir, and you've had a pretty interesting life. It's partly a book about life strategy and how we can navigate life better if we understand risk. Partly a book about the massive risks that we all face collectively right now, existential risks. And really, the most surprising piece of it for me is this explanation of the divide that exists between two tribes of American intellectuals, the probabilistically inclined technologists and hedge fund investors and gamblers that we might associate with the Bay Area, and then sort of the classic liberal intellectuals you might associate with New York. You've had a foot in both of these worlds. You're bilingual, and it seems to me that you felt a kind of duty or that you had a kind of special obligation to explain these two groups to each other, maybe attempt to heal the divide. So I guess to start off, like, what were your original intentions with this book? Did you intend it to be this broad in its ambitions, or did it grow into something larger as you were writing it?
No, in the proposal that my agent and I sent to the publisher, we thought it would be a relatively svelte 65,000 word book. And it's like literally 3 times that. I'm not advertising the length as a feature. Maybe it's a bug.
Right.
But I think because it reflects partly it sounds like a cliche, but it's a little bit of a journey of self-discovery.
Well, let's start with the memoir part of your journey. You're a statistician, a writer, a poker player, but you're really best known to most people listening as the nation's preeminent election forecaster.
Yeah.
You kind of stumbled into this, right? I mean, you say in the opening pages, in covering politics, I've always felt like a fish out of water. So how did you get here?
So the immediate thing that I did before forecasting elections was playing poker, mostly on the internet, and then developing models to forecast how baseball players would perform. And I kind of stumbled into politics because in 2006, the U.S. Congress, like in the last session of the Senate, passed a law to basically cut off payment processing to online poker clients. And that made the games dry up. So all of a sudden I have more free time on my hands, and I'm living in Chicago in 2007. And a guy named Barack Obama, who taught at the school I went to, University of Chicago, was running for president. At the time, I guess I'm 29 years old. And I thought it was pretty exciting. Not the typical stuffed suit politician. And this is kind of at an inflection point where all of a sudden we go through crazy election cycle after crazy election cycle. We're having another one this year, obviously. And we're also in a phase where it's the Moneyballization, I call it, of everything. Moneyball came out in 2003. Mm-hmm. People are like, well, if we apply it to sports, why not to politics, is kind of the thesis, I suppose. And so a lot of being in the right place at the right time. And I think since it's a book about risk and gambling, I mean, understanding that I got lucky in a lot of ways to have lost. I mean, if Congress had never passed that bill, then I'd probably grind it out at poker for a few more years and the games would dry up anyway, and I would be in a much worse position. So sometimes misfortune actually works out well.
Interesting. So you do consider yourself lucky. I mean, I guess to do so, you'd have to believe in luck. Do you believe in luck, or how do you think about it?
I don't believe. I mean, I believe that a lot of events in life are somewhat random and aren't the result of careful planning. So in that sense, I believe that I don't think I believe that some people are permanently lucky or unlucky. I think the kind of closest thing is that I think people are wise to have more optionality in their life, right? Which means to put themselves in a position where they're walking past more doors on a given day, because then there's a chance that one or more of those doors will be open on a given day.
Right. Yes. So you give yourself credit for putting yourself in the way of some positive serendipity, and you got in there. In the 2008 presidential election, you successfully predicted the results in, I think, 49 out of 50 states.
Yeah, everything but Indiana. Yeah.
You predicted Obama's 2012 victory. Then there was 2016, in which you predicted that Hillary's chances were 71%.
Yeah.
You've gotten some flack for this.
A lot of flack.
I'm going to lob you a softball.
Okay.
Did you get it wrong?
No. And the reason we didn't get it wrong is because if you bet on our forecast, you would have made money. the betting odds on Trump were basically 5-1 or 6-1 against, and we were saying it's actually only 2-1 against or so. So if you're a poker player or a sports bettor, you're like, wow, this is great value on this Trump bet. I'm going to lose 70% of the time, but the 29% of the time I win, I make 6 times my money back. That's good. Expected value is a term that we use. So yeah, it was a big divide.
But you could only bet. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you say in the book that you had people buy you dinner because they did make money. And
I won some dinners off
comparatively accurate.
I won some dinners off it from poker playing types.
But you can. Since you can only bet once, though, I mean, if you could bet on that 10 different times, you'd clearly have positive expected value. But I guess it's worth placing the bet with better odds if you can place it. Right, this is the expected value calculation.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I do talk about in the book about expected value is like it clearly is the most applicable in situations that are repeated situations, right? If you get to play out 1,000 hands of poker over the course of a tournament or something, then that's a time where it really applies. Or even everyday things, like the analogy I use is like, let's say you have a commute to work and one route is faster. However, there's a drawbridge sometimes that causes you to be 15 minutes delayed 1/5 of the time, right? Like situations like that are where expected value thinking is appropriate. You know, a situation like, should I marry this person? Should I divorce this person? Should I move to a new state or a new country? The kind of once a decade decisions you make that aren't repeatable, then I'm much more tolerant of people being quote unquote irrational or risk averse, or for that matter, risk tolerant. They apply less there. I think the thing with elections is like, for me, it is kind of drawn out of some larger theoretical sample of possible outcomes, right? You know, the model that I run simulates 40,000 elections, and it's like, okay, sometimes I think on the day before the election, like what number are we going to draw out of that simulation, right? I'm not trying to make any metaphysical point so much as like, you know, if you have a background in poker and sports, then this comes kind of naturally to you. I mean, sports, you literally see the randomness, right? You see like a field goal attempt that hits the crossbar, or a hockey puck that, you know, dings off the post or something like that. You actually see the randomness, and in politics you don't as much. But let me bring up a couple of points. Number one, relatively recently, we had an assassination attempt against Donald Trump. And Donald Trump kind of peered over and turned his head to look at like a billboard that had immigration statistics on it or something. As a result of that, he was just grazed by the bullet instead of seriously or gravely injured. So there are things that are pretty random, right? Dating back to Franz Ferdinand or Archduke Ferdinand, whatever, World War I, the butterfly ballot in Florida, and Al Gore losing by 500 votes and things like that. So even in politics, if you look carefully, or even things like Joe Biden, his team deciding for some reason we want to like have a debate in June, which triggers this whole series of events that leads to him leaving the race. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of things in history that are contingent.
And maybe another way of saying that is that we have incomplete information, that the level of complexity of all the possible developments is so great that we're always dealing with this small subset of the information that we would need to predict with much higher levels of probability. So basically you today would say, you know what, I feel good about that 71% prediction based on all of the information that we could possibly have had access to at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's, I guess, a difference between something that's literally random and a situation where it's just incomplete information. We have limited capacity, as you said, Rufus, in the complexity of the modern world, too. I mean, I think this is why probabilistic thinking is not intuitive to a lot of people, is that as the world becomes more complex, it becomes in some ways more inscrutable, and therefore this skill of thinking probabilistically becomes more important, and it's maybe hard for some people.
Yeah. Well, all right, Nate, we better address the question on the minds of most listeners. You just released earlier this week your first election model since Kamala Harris became the presumptive Democratic nominee. What are Kamala's chances of winning today?
Yeah, I should say we're taping this a little bit in advance of when it airs, but our model has the race at pretty close to 50-50. She has had momentum so far. She is in a much better position than Joe Biden had been. He had fallen behind Trump by around 4 points in the polls and clearly seemed incapable of running a full-fledged normal campaign. But she does face headwinds. One big one is the Electoral College. I think Democrats would be wise not to forget that both in 2000 and 2016, they won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College. Our math says that could happen again. There's a 14% chance or something of that split reoccurring. It's also, we're potentially facing economic headwinds on the day we taped this. A kind of fairly bad jobs report came out, and that can be tough for the incumbent party. But she's run a good campaign so far. And Trump, I think, for some reason, the Trump people weren't thinking probabilistically, right? The Trump campaign was caught very flat-footed and didn't seem prepared for running against a totally different candidate. And so far, the attacks have been pretty weird, verging into areas of race and things like that. I imagine that they will become better attacks over the course of of the campaign, and that Harris will have some news cycles that are more difficult for her. But she's drawn the race into a 50-50 jump ball, and that's about as well as you could hope for, given the predicament Democrats were in with Biden, I think.
Yeah, it's progress from the perspective of Harris supporters. I can't help but feel that Kamala has a momentum advantage right now, in the sense that most people are still learning about her. There's fresh energy around her. It feels to me like the unknowns benefit her, and that she's younger, quicker, less likely to say dumb things that will change the narrative in the next 90-some days. She seems to be exciting young voters. But I think you would say that your model accounts for all these variables, that whatever momentum exists is built into the model. Is that accurate?
In principle, the model is designed in a way where, I mean, the technical term is autocorrelation from day to day. So it efficiently incorporates all information, and therefore the fact that it goes from, she went from 37% to 44% over the course of a couple of days, it doesn't imply anything about the future trajectory. However, Rufus, anytime you're building a model, you have to understand what is the sample of data used to train this model, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have any example in the recent past where a major party changed their candidate in July of the election year. I don't think that renders the model unusable, but it does add some existential uncertainty, especially early on in the race, where we're seeing how her polling settles in. And so, yeah, if you came and told me, I think Harris is a 60-40 favorite and I'm 45-55 the other way, I wouldn't have too much beef with you, right? If you said she's going to win for sure, I'd say, no way, that's ridiculous. Let's make a wager here, right? Give me some odds.
Well, I was interested to see that Polymarket, a prediction market platform with which you're affiliated, has almost identical odds based on bets placed by, I think, a very large number of people. Does this reassure you? Is this something you look at? I think you say in the book that FiveThirtyEight historically performed better than the betting markets.
Yeah, I think, and I do advise Polymarket, so I'm a little bit of a, whatever, I want to disclose that. Yeah. I think these betting markets have gotten a lot better in the last cycle or two. And the reason why is fairly simple, which is that you have enough liquid trading volume now where the kind of classic efficient market incentives kick in a little bit. I had a time where I thought I wouldn't even publish an election model publicly this year. I just would go and consult for a investment bank or a hedge fund or some financial firm. So I went around and talked to people and found there actually is a lot of interest in the market in predicting political risk. No one wanted to spend the high price that my agent and I were asking for the model, but there was a lot of firms that believe that political risk plays into economic risk, and they can't ignore it for the types of bets they're trying to make.
Well, I get the sense that this election modeling game is a drug you can't quit, right? You express kind of mixed feelings about politics in general because it's very emotional. People sort of often have negative responses to probabilistic thinking. Why do you keep forecasting elections when you say you're not that into politics?
I mean, I wrote this book and kind of thought this will be my big transition year out of politics, but kind of in another moment of serendipity. I mean, I've been writing the election model at my Substack newsletter, Silver Bulletin, and I didn't realize how invigorating it would be to be back independent again. And it feels a little bit like 2008, which is the first election that I forecasted, where you don't have any editors. I have one staff member. My partner helps out with graphic design and things like that. So we're kind of a staff of 1.75 people, basically. And I set my own schedule, and, I've always had a strong work ethic, but it's really fun, right? And also the incentives are there where if you write something good, then you see the numbers go up. I mean, that is a thing that is exciting to people when you're in the kind of early growth stage. A little
dopamine release every time you get a Substack report, right? You
sure.
You send out an update on the model, you get X number of new subscribers. It's personal.
No, and look, part of it too is this is a product, the election model, that is intended for a certain type of, frankly, fairly well-informed customer, right? someone who probably is fairly quantitatively minded, someone who's able to decouple their rooting interest in the election from wanting an objective assessment as best as they can of like what will actually happen. And that's a sizable audience. I mean, we have a good subscriber base, but it's like not the ABC News which hosted 538, Walt Disney Company, massive audience, right? So kind of figuring out the right business model, which is a subscriber model where you're writing for a still sizable but smaller group of people than we had at 538 at ABC News. Like that's the right business model for this product, and it's people who understand it a lot more. I mean, I write fairly technical posts sometimes, and it's kind of fun. I have my personal trainers as subscribers. Like I didn't know how kind of much went into this modeling stuff, Nate. It's kind of interesting to read about, and so it's a lot more fun to be able to write in your own language and kind of approach the election in your own way. And hopefully the candidate we have as a 60-40 favorite wins, but I'll be okay if the other outcome happens.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Have you been feeling the effects of stress, burnout, or anxiety at work? Workplace culture is changing, but we're not done yet. Listen to the Anxious Achiever podcast to rethink the relationship between your career and your mental health. Hear stories from psychologists, entrepreneurs, even athletes and celebrities. Learn how they balance success and ambition with staying mentally healthy, and walk away with practical advice you can implement today. Get The Anxious Achiever wherever you find your podcasts.
Okay, let's get to the core thesis of your book, Nate. You spent 3 years interviewing, I think, more than 200 different people, many heavyweights among them, to explore what you describe as a sprawling ecosystem of like-minded people that you call the river. Who are these people?
They're basically people that have two sets of personality traits, one of which is strong analytical abilities. So with some exceptions, I talked to like an astronaut, for example. These are mostly quantitative risk takers, people in tech, poker, finance, crypto, etc. But they pair that with being extremely competitive, wanting to prove other people wrong, being a bit contrarian sometimes, but wanting to compete and be willing to take risks in order to do that. And I guess the thesis is that combination is a very high volatility, high variance combination. If you're smart and willing to gamble and double down a lot, then you can have very good outcomes and you can have catastrophic outcomes like we had with one example in the book, for example, Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yes.
If the capitalist economy is one big poker tournament, and I think in some ways it kind of is, right? It's kind of a winner-take-all economy increasingly, then the people who are willing to make big bets again and again, right, those are the people who you find on the extreme right tail of the distribution of winners and losers, I suppose.
So part of the argument then is that people with this kind of disposition, people who think, as you say, analytically, abstractly, but are also risk tolerant, independent-minded, you say, bordering on contrarian, this turns out to be a highly effective modality to operate in our current world, more so than before.
As finance and tech, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, by the way, I'm just saying as an empirical fact that like finance and tech are becoming a larger and larger fraction of the economy. That's a big shift, that this is dominating the economy more and more. They have more and more power and influence, and this is a skill set that drives that. And so if you're someone who, let's say you are like a progressive anti-capitalist, or you're worried about people like Elon Musk, I mean, I'd still say you should read my book, because even though I'm probably more sympathetic to someone like that than they might be, I can get inside their head a little bit and explain why they're both remarkable and very weird.
Yeah, right. And so you point out that this mindset of people on the river, it's this combination of a kind of mathematical type of analytical probabilistic approach to how you think about the world, but also this kind of competitiveness and risk tolerance, which doesn't necessarily come with a mathematical inclination. Would you describe yourself as having these characteristics? Does this describe you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a sense of like-mindedness that I recognize in people. I mean, look, if you go and play, look, the other day I played a poker game where I'm betting 5 figures per hand, right? I have a high risk tolerance and probably some thrill-seeking tendencies. I like roller coasters. I like spicy food. And by the way, if you look at personality tests, these are actually pretty rare personality traits. To have the very analytical personality trait and the very competitive trait are rare, and even more rare when paired together. So it's not for everybody, for sure.
And you also later in the book quote venture capitalist Josh Wolf of Lux Capital saying that chips on shoulders put chips in pockets, right?
Yeah.
Which I love. In other words, people who have something to prove are more likely to get things done, take those risks. Do you have a chip on your shoulder?
Yeah, probably. I grew up a little bit different. I grew up as a gay kid in the I was born in 1978, but kind of gay kid in the 80s and 90s and kind of a nerd. And, I had great parents, a good upbringing, but always kind of felt like a little bit of an outsider, never quite fit into the kind of corporate job I had out of college. And I was kind of raised on the streets of arguing about politics on the internet and sports on the internet before that, right? Where those are streets where you have to be willing to fight a little bit and be willing to brawl a little bit. And yeah, I no denial about the fact that I'm competitive, and I try to find situations that cater to that, So I didn't realize how much writing my own newsletter, where you are directly rewarded for having better, more thoughtful posts in the form of more traffic and more subscribers. That's much better for me than working for a big giant corporation.
Yep, me too. I can relate.
Yeah.
And you've also spent some time, though, in the neighboring tribe. So we have the river, which you've described, and then we have the village. And you've you spent at least some time also interacting with the village, or maybe even living in the village. Tell us about the village.
So yeah, the village is a term that some other writers have used too, so it's not totally original, but it refers to media, academia, government. It's the quintessential village institutions are Harvard University and the New York Times are the two most respected institutions in the village, for example. And yeah, look, I used to work for the New York Times. I still freelance for them occasionally, right? I'm sure plenty of friends that went to Harvard. It's I can't claim to be totally removed from that. And it's important to emphasize that these are both groups of elites, right? It's not the masses. Sometimes the Silicon Valley people get in a weird situation where they try to pretend they're the voice of the people. And no, they're not. They are the elite of the elite. And they are more successful in many respects than the people in the village. But yeah, the village, I've never quite gotten along with. And part of the self-discovery in the book is trying to understand why.
So this divergence of perspectives between people living on the river and living in the village, I fundamentally buy your argument that this is becoming a core fault line between two groups of American intellectuals, and the divide between them is growing. And frankly, it's a problem. I note this when the topic of Elon Musk comes up. We've talked about Elon Musk with Walter Isaacson on this show and with Kara Swisher, and I find it coming up with friends. There's a heat to the conversation that's about much more than just Musk as an individual. There's a tribal thing that's happening there. And so why do you think the dissonance between these two camps is escalating? And do you think it's important that we talk about it?
Yeah, look, I think, and I should say, Silicon Valley is kind of the tip of the sphere for the river, and not necessarily representative of the entire river, right? There are still more Democrats and Republicans, even in the river, probably just because educated people these days tend to be more Democratic leaning. But yeah, some of the events we've seen in the past year, the hearings in Congress over the anti-Semitism on campus, which whatever it was, Harvard, Penn, MIT, Those are canonical village institutions. And you have the river agitating to have these people fired. Like that's a hot war, no longer a cold war between them. The fact that like you have more people in Silicon Valley explicitly embracing Trump, but keep in mind that like they have narrow rational self-interest reasons to endorse Trump, right? They expect less regulation of their businesses. They expect more favorable tax treatment, both individually and for their businesses, right? Trump may be friendlier to AI regulation and crypto regulation than a Biden administration, or Harris, I should say now, would be. And so which is the chicken and the egg is hard to say. I mean, there are also cultural grievances. I think some people in Silicon Valley are very happy to talk your ear off about, you know, how their workforce is too woke and things like that. So there's some element of that probably. But, you know, the human brain is very good at like rationalizing self-interest. But look, there are also personality clashes where people in the river think that, oh, the village is too political. They're politicizing everything. And of course, before long, Elon Musk is very politics pilled too. And so I wish there were a better ambassador for the river who said just, hey, we're just going to do our thing, right? And do our thing and leave us alone. And yeah, don't regulate us in ways that are unhelpful and inefficient, but like, we're just going to do our thing and make cool products. But, you know, once you kind of get warped into the politics zone, then it's hard to find the escape hatch.
I have felt myself as a serial entrepreneur for a few decades in the digital media space to kind of have a foot on both sides of this divide. Yeah. I've been a bit of an Elon Musk apologist, believing for many years that he had a net positive impact on the world. I kind of buy Walter Isaacson's take that you have to take the good with the bad when it comes to Elon, and the world needs unreasonable people. You know, George Bernard Shaw. All progress depends on the unreasonable man. Like I think that he's played an important and healthy role. But honestly, his endorsing Trump and donating generously to his campaign was sort of an inflection point for me. And honestly, I just struggled to understand how Musk and Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen can get behind Trump. I mean, clearly they have a different assessment of the risk that Donald Trump poses than I do, or I think many people do. So I would ask you, like living as you do near them on the river, how do they think about it? Like, do they not see this as a potential threat to democracy?
Yeah, I think they've kind of lost enough trust in the village to buy the threat to democracy argument. Whereas I think there are some threats. I don't think it's an acute threat, but I think there are significant tail risks, as I term them, with Trump, as well as maybe, you know, more likely outcomes of just kind of denigrating the fabric of democracy and American institutions over time, right? I mean, I don't think the world's going to end, but like that's one of the village arguments that I am somewhat democracy pilled, I guess I'd say. Not completely, but I somewhat buy that. I think they think that like the emperor has no clothes though in the village. I mean, you know, Mark Andreessen cited the 2016 election where everyone claimed that Hillary was a great candidate and was going to win, and then turned around. This is in his thought bubble, right? And then turned around and kind of unfairly blamed Facebook for the fact that Trump won instead of themselves. Like that was a big fork in the road for people like Andreessen, I think. You know, I think, you know, these are, as am I, middle-aged white guys who can feel aggrieved by some of the cultural stuff a little bit. I mean, it's kind of overdetermined. I mean, they have it's, you know, because fundamentally, like there are divergent personality types. Yeah. The core thesis of Silicon Valley is that you need to be willing to make these long-term, high upside bets on ideas that might take 10 years to play out. And so inherently, it's a place that is resistant toward groupthink and conformity, even though there's lots of groupthink and conformity, of course, within Silicon Valley. But like inherently, there's just, you know, it's a little bit of an oil and water thing. And now you've, I don't know where we're going with this metaphor. Now you strike a match and set the oil on fire, and then it gets a lot more haywire. Yeah. But like, but this is overdetermined is a term that I'd use. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a direct probability question. If Trump wins, what do you think the probability is that he A, accepts the results of the next election that replaces him versus tries to subvert the democratic process, and B, is successful at overturning the election results?
Yeah, I don't know the former. I mean, I think there's a pretty good chance that he wouldn't accept the results if he doesn't win.
Right.
I think the latter is quite low. I don't know, you know, I'd say with 98% probability there will be a 2028 election, right? That will be, and 95% probability that will be recognized as being largely democratic, lowercase d, by outside observers by the United Nations. So that's not zero, right? It's 2% or 5% chance of really bad outcomes. And if you're thinking in expected value terms, then it's worth thinking about that. But yeah, I mean, maybe this is a case where like prediction markets would be helpful. If people say rhetorically things like, oh, this will be the last election unless Harris wins. Okay. How much are you willing to bet on that, right? Let's set up a prediction market and have you actually quantify that intuition.
Yes, because I think this is a big difference of opinion between people in the village and in the river, which is I think a lot of villagers think there's a very meaningful probability that democracy ends, right? Which in my mind, my numbers are closer to yours. I might put it at like a sub 5% probability, which is still, by the way, terrifying to me. I mean, given that I think it's unacceptable as a risk, right? Which is why I think it's an important election.
No, look, I think January 6th was close enough, right? That's disqualifying to me, right? That's why I will somewhat proudly vote for Kamala Harris, full disclosure. But yeah, look, the democracy is on the line argument actually was one of the limitations, I think, of Biden's campaign, where if you look at polling data, the New York Times has very good polls these days where they really identify voters who often wouldn't respond to polls. They take more time and spend more money to make sure they call as many people as many times as possible to get their answers. And the democracy is on the line argument wasn't working very well with marginal voters, according to these polls, that like the everyday person who says, well, look, Biden's in office. He won last time. We just had a competitive midterm in 2022 and Democrats have the Senate and power is pretty balanced, right? So how can you have a Democratic president saying democracy is on the line when we survived the last 4 years of Trump? I mean, it's a tougher sell than I think people want to admit to. In part because I think like, you know, what January 6th was ultimately a very severe near miss, right? That if the crowd or the mob, whatever you want to call them, the rioters had gotten into the Senate cloakroom or whatever and actually began to attack senators or whatever, then you have maybe the worst day in American history or something, right? And instead you have, you know, the Capitol Police intervene and the senators hide and things are upheld kind of at the last moment. And like near misses aren't enough to scare people sometimes, right? Even actual misses. I mean, even after the COVID-19 pandemic, we're still not spending enough money for future pandemic preparedness. If you look at the amount of money we're spending in Congress is actually quite small. So yeah, it's a tougher sell for Biden than I think he thought. And therefore Harris, I think, is trying some new themes out and so far seems to be more successful.
So Riverians, in your parlance, are increasingly running the world. At one point, you're channeling Peter Thiel. You say, the quants won, we're living in their world. But at the same time, you suggest later in the book that residents of the river may underestimate the power of the village. How do you see this playing out in the coming years and decades?
So certainly on the issue of AI, there is bipartisan concern. I mean, nothing's bipartisan in the country anymore, but this is actually an area where both Trump and Biden in their own ways have made statements about, you know, concerns about runaway AI risk. And both Democrats and Republican voters say, yeah, actually, the idea of these super powerful computers that kind of take over all major functions in society, like that seems like a dystopian nightmare, right? And there's something that like, you know, as someone who does go back and forth between the river and the village,
yes,
the notion that we're just going to hand over the keys to AI willingly seems to neglect the political incentives of the system and people's individual behavior, right? So, I mean, look, when something is a really high stakes decision, then I would argue that like, then the village is more likely to get it right. And one example of it actually, like the decision to replace Biden with Harris, that was actually, I think, a pretty canny act of probabilistic thinking where they're like, well, we're going to go from a 25% chance to a 50% chance. And that's worth doing because the expected value gain is so high. And like, you know, in that case, they made a good decision. I mean, you know, COVID might argue the other way, where I don't know how well the world responded to COVID, although we did make lots of changes in society. Yeah. We didn't just go about our business. So when there's something that big, I mean, I you know, and also the fact that like, you know, I mean, even if AI were benevolent, right? Like who the fuck gives OpenAI or Sam Altman or Anthropic or Google the right to like take over all our lives and tell us, here's what's actually going to be good for you. Something has to, if the revolution happens, there's probably going to be some, I think I mean this figuratively and not literally, but, probably some like bloody battles first, right?
Yes,
revolutions,
right.
The Industrial Revolution was also correlated with a bunch of political revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, right? These things are not simple, seamless transitions.
You just heard part one of my two-part conversation with Nate Silver. He'll be back on Thursday when we'll talk about what we can actually learn from the river, how we can all harness the superpower that is probabilistic thinking. Plus, we'll talk about the river's fallen figurehead, Sam Bankman-Fried, and what his demise tells us about the limits of a Riverian worldview. We'll also get into AI risk. Nate's got a surprising take here. If you can't wait until Thursday, good news, you can hear my entire conversation with Nate right now in the next Big Idea app. If you're not using our app already, shame on you. Just kidding. Seriously, if you're not using it, go to the App Store and search for the next Big Idea. Once you have the app, you'll be able to listen to ad-free versions of this show, as well as hundreds of book summaries written and read by the authors themselves. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. There's a 100% probability that the LinkedIn Podcast Network is our favorite podcast network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you on Thursday.